Howdy ho, everyone! In this video, I've compiled the many adventures and misadventures I've undertaken over the course of my tenure as mayor in Cities Skylines. Over the years, I've made many attempts to experiment and discover what features characterize the perfect utopia. This video is a compilation of all those attempts gathered into one presentation, cut, edited, and enhanced for modern viewership. So without any further ado, it is my great pleasure to present to you the urban misadventures of the ambiguous kind. A Cities Skylines Compilation. In this video, I'm going to share what I learned from 100 years of city building. I've always wanted to sit down with Cities Skylines, but there's just so much content. I was honestly a bit intimidated. There's an overwhelming amount of information to consume if you want to be any good at this game. So I decided to forget that altogether and just be authentically not good. Ditch the strategy guides, and just use the method of guess and test. Try out an urban design that you think will work. If it doesn't, then scrap it and move on. Keep repeating this with every neighborhood, highway, and disaster you encounter until you have a majestic and great city. Welcome to Westfield, June 17th, 2022. Population 0. An empty highway exit, a building permit, and the starting money, $70,000. Or city dollars. Every time you play Cities Skylines, you're really building two cities, not one. The second one is your ideal city, the one you truly want to make. But the first one you build is not pretty. It's designed to make money and get people into the city, and unlock all of the inaccessible buildings and infrastructure at a low level of population. Kind of like a trick that the game designers are playing on you to make you mess up before you get to do what you really want to do. Using the limited tools available, I paved roads that made a beeline for the nearest body of water, a river running from the east to the south border of town. We'll need this river in a moment, but first the task is 1. Build a power plant, cheap, effective coal from the edge of town. 2. Pump clean water from upriver, and 3. Dump waste downriver, where it just disappears. We'll just link those together, run a few power poles, and voila! An urban backbone. Now that we've bounded everything, let's color it in with some zoning. This part's easy, just put industry near the edge of town by the power plant, then put residential zones far, far away, as far as possible, and add commercial zones between as a buffer to pollution. Done. Now, what I'm testing out here in year 1 is my default hypothesis that grids, the most naive approach, make for the best cities. After all, grids make good sense. Reliable, strong squares, sensible if a bit boring, they're probably the most common shape that smooth-brained civil engineers select in civil planning. But how big should the squares be? If we make the squares too small, we'll pay too much for maintenance. So I settled on this size of square. Pretty good, both for traffic and for fitting many houses. I laid out the grid foundation and hit Pop 900, a worthy village, endowed with copious new opportunities at expansion. The grid grew, so I started setting out services, like fire departments, recycling centers, and schools to keep our people happy and less stupid. Unfortunately, an earthquake erupted just yards away, narrowly missing our grid on the fault line. Tiny town. Our next achievement at a pop of 1400. Still not impressive at all, though. But here's the real rub with the grid. It's sensible, it's dense, it's unfortunately very boring, but it also separates the pollution from the greenery pretty well. I expanded the grid and built a cemetery to hold the dead, many of whom had perished from the unfortunately deadly air pollution. Remember how I said before that every time you build a city in Cities Skylines, you build two cities? I lied, you actually build many more than two cities, but each time you change something and try to improve on the old formula. Now that I had unlocked new and improved road designs, like the 3-lane highway, I was no longer limited to the stupid formula of just making everything a 2-lane road. So I extended the highway exit to accommodate the final part of my grid, another grid. But this time I used the highway itself to separate all the residential and commercial zones from the industrial areas. You know how this works. Make the donuts on the industrial side of the town, then ship them into the mouths of the people living across the highway. It was almost perfect, save for some traffic backing up. This always catalyzes a change. To fix the traffic, I tore down and reformatted the exit into a clover leaf. Naturally, after building these grids for so long, one wonders, is there another way? So we entered phase 2 of the experiment, circles. In phase 1, I had confirmed what I already knew. Squares are boring, but they do work. They have a few little problems like build-up in popular parts of town. Circles are everything that squares aren't. They're like the yin to a square's yang. Infinite sides, impossible to draw, but ultimately way better looking than squares. I zoned commercial zones and offices near the center, and apartment buildings along the outside. 4 quarters, carved out neatly by another cloverleaf intersection. I personally like building circles and curved infrastructure in cities' skylines because it looks beautiful and it makes me feel smarter. You know, in retrospect, this circle formation was highly inefficient. You have to cross a 6-lane highway anytime you leave the house. But it looks so good that it helps you ignore the fact that each interior circle is virtually isolated from the others, causing manifold traffic snafus. So I linked the two cities, circle and square, and decided that ultimately, the square city, though more boring than its circular counterpart, was ultimately the superior choice of urban design. Naturally, the next shape in my experiment was the triangle. The simplest of shapes. You can't possibly make a shape with 2 sides, though I was pessimistic about its structural utility. Fun fact, if you build a city of triangles, you're also building one of hexagons for the price of one. Unfortunately, it also leads to bizarre hexagonal 6-way intersections. Yuck. I decided to make Triangle Town an entirely industrial segment. Our pop had just hit a big city of 17,000, and we were starting to buckle under our own size. Supply chain issues were beginning to rear their ugly heads. Triangle Town was in a constant traffic gridlock, totally unsalvageable, but at least I had tried. The thought occurred to me, what if I was overcomplicating things? Just one big zigzag for the next neighborhood. Strangely, this does start to resemble the Hollywood Hills, a neighborhood designed to keep you out, unless you have wheels. Then there was a tsunami. Westfield was now Wetfield, at the suggestion of my Twitch audience. The tsunami was Noahic, biblical and sublime like the judgment of Providence. Almost no one survived as the population dropped. Then Wetfield's coffers dried up, and it wasn't long before we were hopelessly opening loans to stay afloat. But when things look grim, you can always just declare bankruptcy in America. So we buried the power lines, built a huge canal and a seawall, and went much, much deeper into the red. Proudly bankrupt. Then there was a fire, then there was a sinkhole, then there was a thunderstorm, then there was a tornado. But after only another 25 years of waiting, we returned to positive cash flows, acquired more land, and became a capital city. We wouldn't be trifled with, not even by a tsunami. Maybe the zigzag thing was tangential, but not as tangential as this actual tangent. Yeah, that one didn't work either. Okay, now time for a new serious experiment. Roundabouts. The roundabouts were the best of both worlds. Round and square at the same time. Honestly, I'm not sure how they do it, but they might be the perfect solution to traffic, which was virtually non-existent inside the district. High quality of life, attractive surroundings, demand soared. We became a colossal city with another tsunami. The seawall did nothing, like a sand castle in front of a large wave. What was I doing wrong? Everyone died again. I raised the entire waterfront hundreds of feet higher to combat the anger of the sea, and I began dumping doo-doo into the ocean in hopes to reverse the tide against the most probable third tsunami. At least, shielding myself with a large plateau of feces would give me peace of mind. To complete my final experiments with urban design, a neighborhood shaped like a star, a big spiral, and the Sierpinski gasket. You know, at least the city was finally making money again and back in the green. But if you want my honest opinion, I don't think any of these were very good city designs. Maybe the roundabouts. They have that je ne sais quoi. Curvilinear and yet still rectilinear, permitting the smooth flow of traffic. Grids are fine, but I stand by it. They're boring. Rhombuses look cool, but they offer little value beyond that of the squares. In the end, I got a city full of dead people, crime, and garbage. I resorted to helicopter police, and if we ever get the grant, I will be the first in line to pursue helicopter-based garbage collection services. But I scratched the itch, and ultimately maybe some of these ideas will pop into future cities. But some of them were just better off in the dank recesses of my imagination. Today I'm going to try to build a city in the middle of the ocean, starting with just this one square of land. It's the Island Start challenge. Normally when you play Cities Skylines, you're building on the ground. But what if there were no ground? Instead, I installed a bunch of mods and I leveled an entire map below sea level except this one square, which is just barely above sea level, and connected it to the mainland only by this one extremely long and tenuous bridge. I set 3 goals. 1. Could I build a city in the water that was both profitable and happy by expanding the island? 2. Could I reconnect the roadways and re-establish regional traffic? And 3, maybe the most difficult, how long would it take to refill the entire landscape with dirt again instead of water? I started on February 24th, 2026. I guessed if I couldn't get it done in about 100 years, then it was pretty much worthless. So that was my end goal. The starting money, $300,000. I start off with a few basic needs I knew I'd require to get the city populated. Power plant, roads, water pump for the clean water, drainage for poop, and I zoned everything. Right, wait, you're not making money, and we needed to establish positive cash flow before we hit $0, or we'd be in major trouble, in need of a financial bailout, which we just didn't have. I terraformed the land to expand our borders. Unfortunately, anytime you do this, it causes a massive tidal wave that floods the city. Since I had decided to dump the sewage onto one side of the island directly into the ocean, it was creating a tide of doo-doo that was flowing toward the drinking water, meaning it was a race against time. Keep expanding the island's arms to contain the tainted waters and build our civilization around procrastinating to clean up the poop. Thus, by defunding the hospital and police, we were actually able to secure a positive tax cash flow and build a landfill where we put even more of the garbage that was piling up. In the midst of all this, I built a medical clinic to make sure everyone stayed alive, and then I raised taxes to keep expanding and bring in more people. Demand was high. Even I didn't think our society was very good, but people just kept streaming in like refugees until we broke a bustling population of 2,000. Things were looking good, except for the giant growing poop stain in the ocean. It was lowering property values, but our people were too dumb to notice. There were perks to being uneducated, and at the end of the day, it was our poop stain. By 4 years in, I decided we'd need to start funding municipal services, or we would certainly suffocate ourselves with the massive pile of untreated sewage we were creating in the ocean. So I built an elementary school to educate people to eventually clean up the problem. The island's residents got smarter. I expanded more. Now it wasn't just tidal waves, but tidal waves of doo-doo water washing up in the streets. On the bright side, fortunately this meant we didn't require a fire department, since everyone's house was flooded just with raw sewage. And though it wasn't pretty, it was growingly profitable. I was halfway to my first goal, make a profitable city. Now just to get these people happier. We built a dog park. They loved it. It helped them ignore the pressing concern of ecological disaster, and in time, they had educated themselves enough to build an eco-friendly water plant, spewing out clean, clear water instead of the tainted crap they had into the ocean. We'd stemmed the tide, and that being said, we'd still have to clean up the brown water, and it remained there on the horizon as a reminder of our tainted past. So by 2033, our city had turned profitable and eco-friendly. It was time to provide our residents with fun, recreation, the amusement park. Unfortunately, everyone tried to steal by entering without paying. So I erected a perimeter wall to make people pay at the main gate. Success! Demand and property values soared in nearby districts. The citizens were happy, the poop was moving away from our shores, and the amusement park was fun. And so with the seed of a sustainable civilization planted, I began gradually expanding the island in a slow grind toward completely filling the ocean with dirt. So much ocean before us, it was extremely expensive, hundreds of thousands of dollars for just a single city block. Not to mention the thousands of innocent lives lost to drowning during the intermittent tidal surges that came alongside it every couple weeks. But it was encouraging to observe the foothold and growth of grass on the shoreline along the freshly dumped sands. By 2035, our population had crested 10,000, and I expanded southward, adding land block by block and accommodating new projects. But now the city was completely full of garbage, so we started just burning it and cleaned up the remaining crap in the ocean with this floating garbage collector. So the city improved. People were happier, we were making money, and we were filling up the land. It was kind of a grind, but what about connecting the highways? Well, it turned out we had to pad those with a landfill too. After all, a mile-long bridge costs upward of $150,000 just to build in the first place. It would be cheaper in the long run to just fill the ocean than worry about it later. So I raised the land and unintentionally knocked out some drivers because it turned out I had accidentally terraformed over one of the Earth's elusive blowholes, a point at which the planet pews out water into the ocean. It's tricky to avoid these, but I continued filling up the ocean with landfill, carefully working around them. However, in growing the city, the problems were beginning to multiply. Growing our population, for example, had made traffic unmanageable. So finally, once we had brought down the highways from up in the air and onto the ground, I decided to address the traffic problem in the city entrances. I burrowed down into secret tunnels from the highway exits to let traffic into the other parts of the city, fixing the traffic jams, but also making us extra vulnerable to the constant intermittent flooding underground and nonsensical dangerous intersections. But as the problems multiply, our tools grew. Now we're making nearly $40,000 a week in taxpayer money, so that after 22 years of terraforming, we had reached out our landmass to touch the north border of the square that our city inhabited. An exciting milestone, but along with the growth came another problem. The power demand was getting so high that natural gas was no longer scaling effectively to meet the city's needs. The solution was nuclear power plants, unstable and liable to blow up at any time, and right in the middle of one of the most populated and commonly flooded areas filled with innocent people at work. For all those drawbacks, the city did start to produce a surplus of power, slashing citizens' energy bills, raising demand, and necessitating the link-up of yet even more highways with a nice cloverleaf intersection, weaving together the underground and overground roads. Then I took a moment to just step back and admire the city. So much progress we had made from an embryonic square to this churning terramorphic expanse. Landfill. 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 Something blew up in the nuclear power plant, so we just built another one in the year 2057. As an apology to the residents, I lowered taxes and built them a zoo, causing a whole flood of new demand. Then a literal flood because I accidentally caused a tsunami by terraforming like this. It was okay, we had water pumps, and I had finally paved the city into a bona fide grid for smooth traffic flow. At this point in time, I knew it was going to take a while to generate the tax funds required to fill the rest of the ocean with dirt, so I decided to just leave my computer running overnight. And I woke up after another 50 years with $14 million, which it so happens still wasn't enough money, so I had to go out and do some errands while I left it running again. Finally, and that was just about enough money. I checked back on my computer, and we had enough to fill up the rest of the ocean. Another milestone and another goal completed. But I'd waited so long that everyone in town was dead. Or at least, there were a lot of dead bodies lying around. Apparently, some people insisted on being buried in a cemetery rather than the eco-friendly route of cremation. So I started building more graveyards to house the dead, but then I ordered them to dig up the dead bodies to the crematoriums to just burn them anyway. We all need to make sacrifices for each other in this society. Otherwise, the city would have eventually just turned into one big graveyard. We aimed to raise efficiency by putting the crematorium next to the graveyard, next to the elder care facility. I think citizens made the implicit connection. It was brutal, but also logistical. With most of the landscape terraformed, the only remaining bodies of water were those needed to empty out the few water blowholes we had discovered into the sea. I connected the dots, forming the backbone of our river system. Now it wasn't stagnant water, but roaring rapids that could safely flush the poop out into the ocean. Back to my original goals. 1. I had terraformed the land. Check. 2. I had connected all the highways, cleared for travel. Check. And 3. My city was now profitable. But no one was happy. Men in balaclavas roamed the streets. 50% of our society had dropped out of elementary school or never attended at all. We had only 69% average health. I lamented the fact that nearly 100 years had passed, and I hadn't even taken care of anyone. Yes, I mean it was necessary to feed people and secure a brighter future. But I'd built the city that was just a factory to produce money to fill up the ocean and flush away poop. What if our whole civilization was just one big, glorified toilet bowl? I mean, there was literally a business called Customer Service Services. I had created a fake economy based on nothing, acting like you're working. What was all this expansion, logistics, focus on GDP when deep down our people were just quietly miserable? So I gave them what they deserved. Zoos, parks, airports, subways, things to get them around and make the most of their sad little lives. I guess I'm just trying to say, in the words of the gorillas, don't get lost in heaven. We had everything we wanted. We built this expansive economic powerhouse, but at what human cost? Anyway, it's important to stop and smell the grass and the roses along the way. Thank you for joining me on this journey. In this video, I'm going to try to build a city with 0% tax in cities' skylines. It's not a big secret that no one likes paying taxes, and some people think that if we just charge people only for the public services they chose to use, we could create a more fair, just taxation system in our country. It sounds good. So I set out with the intention of seeing if this would be possible in a simulation with a basic starter city in Cities Skylines. Let's start at square one. Normally in Cities Skylines, the lowest you can drop taxes in a standard game is 1%. I think it's against the spirit of the challenge to allow even that, so we're going to open our handy-dandy, policy-based tax menu to drop the taxes in every sector, except industrial, which isn't allowed for some reason. And that'll get our entire city's taxes down to a true 0%. Done. So before we've begun, we've set out the foundations in our policies for a 0% tax city. Okay, but now funding it is going to be a whole different project. We need some default starting capital or we won't be able to build anything. $500,000. With absolutely nothing in our city aside from the interstate entryway ramp, we are neither gaining nor losing money. Entry highway maintenance costs are subsidized by the state, so that's out of our fiscal hands. But from the moment we lay our first roads, it's going to be very expensive to grow and maintain our city, so we need to plan ahead. Cash flows don't manage themselves, and if we run out of money, the challenge is over. Let's start with first things first. Every city needs power, water, and roads. When we start building roads for our homes, they're going to be very pricey to maintain. Since we don't want to charge people, we'll quickly run out of money, so we can kiss all traditional ideas of building up a normal city goodbye. The first city I built relied upon tourism to secure public funding. There were tolls to enter and exit the city, and they were making tens of dollars from travelers just at the gates alone. Once they entered the town, the strategy was that once we had them trapped inside, we'd rake in the dough from using popular tourist locations, such as our hot air balloon rental service, as well as our seaside restaurant, fishing pier, and jet ski ride pavilion. On paper, the plan was foolproof, but in execution, the lack of a fire department, police force, healthcare, and corpse disposal services meant that the few dollars we had each month went toward barely securing enough water and power for the city to operate. Crime was rampant. People got sick and just died. Then leftover human corpses filled up the restaurant and the other tourist sites, making them unattractive venues for visitors. And the hot air balloon riders just flew off and away into the sky. There wasn't really any way to enforce that. Without any tourism or anyone entering the city anymore, all the homes were abandoned, everyone just left, and the city went deep into the red as crime and fire spread. In a word, it failed. So I decided to cut my losses and just try again. I had learned lots from this first city, and I could use it to build the second one the right way. The second city. After the first one failed, I saved my progress and started fresh. If tourism didn't work, what could be the answer? I decided that the tolls in the first city were a pretty good idea, so I kept those at the only entrance to the town. Since this was literally the only thing that was working for me, I decided to find a way to force them to pay tolls at every possible turn to try to squeeze as much cash as I possibly could out of the population, even if it was trivial and inconvenient, like putting all of the residential areas on one side of the river and then all of the commercial and office zones on the other side of the river, connected only by a very narrow bridge and an expensive toll booth. This nearly worked if it weren't for the fact that almost everyone in the town was uneducated and too stupid to work in an office building. We tried funding elementary schools with the meager profits from the few people who were smart enough to work in an office. But this town also, unfortunately, ended in a downward taxation spiral, which concluded with all the familiar sights and sounds of dead people, abandoned buildings, and men in balaclavas up to no good. The third city. They say the third time's the charm. Surely with all the failures from the first two dumpster fires, we could now put something together. And we did. The third city was the first city that was architecturally attractive and had a sensible plan for funding. Now we had toll booths not only at the entrance, but also just kind of nearby the town to suck the maximum amount of money from anyone who came anywhere remotely close to our borders. An attractive layout with a grid of 4 spherical neighborhoods for residential, commercial, industrial, and corporate buildings. Not only were we able to max out the tolls for passing between neighborhoods, but we were also able to maximize the effective radius of public services, like healthcare and education. Unfortunately, this also made it highly flammable, and each neighborhood was a massive fire hazard. I had faith in this town. I mean, it almost broke even, too, even with several municipal services. But its population also, unfortunately, suffered from a catastrophic downward spiral after everyone's jobs were erased, along with the industrial district, by the Great Fire of August 2023. Okay, so that didn't work, but the fourth city is where everything really started coming together. I hadn't failed, I had just not succeeded 3 times in a row. Now, not only did we have the tolls nearby, into, and just around the town, but now we began experimenting with a new way of making money. That is, erecting an expensive amusement park between the residential zone and the rest of the city where all the jobs and services were located. It was not a good amusement park. It was just a path between 2 entrances. That is to say, there was nothing amusing about it, but it became growingly profitable, so much to the point that I decided to make more of them, and then make them even shorter so that people would have to pay for multiple amusement parks, containing just more paths if they wanted to get to work. Still in the red. At this point in time, I decided that the traditional asphalt roads were becoming too expensive to maintain, and so I used my resources to replace them all with much less expensive dirt roads. At long last, our city was finally breaking even. Just kidding, it actually wasn't. It took until the 5th city for it to really break even, but who truly knows after I tried to sort through all the save files I named badly. The point is, this time we had fires, crime, dead bodies, and garbage all covered by funding from a gamut of 4 amusement parks all in a row. Broad Park, Groveland, Fun World, and who could forget Belmont Experience, where people fought every morning over not enough parking spots to allow the peaceful passage of pedestrian foot traffic through one park, around the street, across the next park, around another street, and then all over again, then followed by a long walk to work on the dirt road. And that's only one way. Also, everyone lives right near the dump, and that's just barely breaking even by maybe $10 or $20 a month, until of course the astronomical sanitation bill eats into our city's budget and causes the undesirable pileup of garbage in everyone's house. It's really hard to keep track of what's even going on in this city, since we're always panicking about the budget and barely surviving by just a few dollars. And the city still had problems, and expenses were still teetering on being too expensive. I got rid of the crematorium because it was too expensive to burn the bodies. And I just started dumping the dead bodies into cemeteries, located right next to the dump on either side of town. We'd deal with all that later. Right now, the more pressing concern was that businesses wanted people that were smart, and everyone was dumb in town. No one had achieved more than an elementary school education, so when these commercial enterprises were built, unfortunately, they were abandoned when the staff didn't know how to run the companies because they were too stupid. Still, demand soared for 0% residential tax. All that despite the fact that there were no jobs in town. So running out of space, we zoned denser housing projects, and we started just using martial law to demolish businesses right after they were built, if it looked like that they were going to aim to recruit people that were just too smart for our town. It's not morally dubious, it's for the common good. It was at this point in time that I learned how to double the ticket prices in all the amusement parks, joining the residential and commercial sides of town, thereby nearly doubling our monthly tax income, as well as squeezing in a zoo at the end of the expensive transportation route. Now it cost $200 just to walk from one side of town to the other. Fortunately, this added a surprise surplus to our budget, allowing us to build a high school to educate our smooth-brained citizens. This then allowed us to reopen the office buildings and end the ethically questionable and morally dubious practice of state-ordered demolitions on newly erected businesses to prevent gentrification. Finally, now our city wasn't even collecting the little wealth granted by the industrial zones, and it was a true 0% tax city at long last. And honestly, it wasn't all that far off from several hypothetical libertarian fantasies, until the dead bodies started piling up, and the garbage situation got out of hand. What to do? They couldn't be demolished by traditional means, that's not allowed. At this point in time, of all the tools at my disposal, only one seemed inviting and crazy enough to work. A meteor. No one would suspect that the catastrophic meteor of August 2024 was an inside job. A redirecting of a meteor, but it would take out the garbage and the dead bodies. You know, it doesn't interfere with the people who are alive. They don't have to pay tax. Just the dead people have to get hit by a meteor, and it destroys all the garbage and probably sends it horribly out into the atmosphere. But, I mean, it's free, so, you know, I did what I had to make this city tax-free. Finally, I had achieved my goal. A questionably sustainable city with $0 tax. That costs $400 to walk around in, but only if you decide to walk through part of it, which, as it happens, most people have to, but they could just choose to stay home. And that's their decision. I believe I did a good job. You can compliment me down there in the compliments section of the video. Even if it took me 5 attempts, I believe I've made my point. 0% tax city, achieved. Anyway, a big thanks to my patrons, all of whom consensually choose to pay me to make these videos. I'm Ambiguous Amphibian. Until next time. In this video, I'm going to build a city that doesn't rely on roads and cities' skylines. Everyone knows that cars are polluting hunks of metal that destroy our planet. Hypothetically, could we design and engineer a town that's completely walkable, eliminating the need for the maintenance and upkeep of expensive streets and highways which crack and require maintenance year after year? So it was christened pedestrianism. I decided to set out with the limited array of tools available to me in Cities Skylines. So it began with the first city, Pedestrianton. In City Skylines, I always start my cities with water and a power plant. Unfortunately, the standard coal power plant requires, well, a street to be built. So instead, I used wind turbines, which require no street access in order to generate electrical energy. But in this first city, with power and water going, I still had one problem. You can't actually zone any residential, commercial, or industrial building zones without a street. Seeing as this is a no streets challenge, you can see how this would get in the way. So I decided I'd rely minimally upon streets in this first city, then take the lessons out with me to the next city so that I could improve upon the design. Since streets would invite cars, I decided to just create roads that were utterly pointless and led in circles to nowhere. And also ban combustion engines, so that anyone caught driving in a car on the road would be under arrest for violating the law. I also separated the residential zones in their own circle from the commercial and industrial zones in their own circles, unintentionally beginning to exhibit a pattern like alien crop circles. Then I joined them via dirt walking paths from one district to another to encourage walking. Well, not really encourage, but just force people to walk. Or even take the bike paths which went shooting overhead. But there was still yet one more problem. Despite my combustion engine ban and pointless road design, people were still driving from house to house in electric cars, thereby using the roads again. So I decided to make the streets not even streets anymore, but just little dots of concrete, making for a truly bizarre place to live. But at least the roads were no longer being used, just the dirt paths. A city that no longer relied upon streets. The only problem was that now no one could get their garbage taken out because there were no roads for the garbage trucks, causing a mass buildup of trash in everyone's disgusting house. And the lack of police cars and roads meant that the cops executed the law via helicopter, which was admittedly both excessive and expensive. So I decided that the only possible solution was just to destroy people's houses whenever they had too much trash in there. Then let someone else build another house instead. After all, demand was roaring. Then when they had too much garbage, the cycle repeated and I also destroyed their house. Unfortunately, all of this drove us into massive bankruptcy. This first city, which relied on all of the vanilla game parts, was a failure. Okay, but that's alright, this was all just a practice test for the second city, Pedestrian Tin 2. Realizing that the garbage situation would not and could not ever be fixed, I looked for answers elsewhere. And while I think you should save up your money, the only solution I found was to literally buy the DLC for Pedestrian Towns, which I admit was rather naive. I didn't start this whole challenge with that one to begin with. This allowed me to replace the traditional roads with brick-paved pathways on which to accommodate the foot traffic, and still allow for the zoning and construction of residential, commercial, and industrial buildings along the footpaths. And so I got to zoning. Admittedly a very boring city of grids to start with, but I had to test out how we would collect garbage at the pedestrian checkpoints, then deliver that to only one little road that led to the town via the highway. See, the road isn't in the town, so it doesn't count. I know what you're thinking. Doesn't that seem kind of against the spirit of the challenge to still have one road in a totally roadless playthrough? But hear me out. This road is different. Cars just disappeared for some reason, then pooped out people at the end of the road. And then the vehicles drove into the side of the building, never to be seen again. Alright, so to be fair, the main part of the city shouldn't have roads. Otherwise, I'd just keep having to bulldoze the houses for literally any issue. Pile up of garbage will be right on our way to destroy your house. You need the police? A team of men are coming right away with sledgehammers to knock in your walls. No more problem over there. This city was good, except for the fact that it was losing buckets of money every day. You see, pedestrian areas are extra pricey to maintain. It seemed like a utopia, except for the fact that it was losing millions and millions of dollars and was horribly unsustainable. A shame. The third city. Pedestrian Tin 3. Okay, so maybe grids weren't the best idea. Too many roads to maintain had made the second city expensive, and all the trash was gathered in a lopsided way on one side of the city before. But what about a set of concentric circles with the dump at their center? It was a brilliant and efficient design. An underground highway pooped out the garbage from the city, and the trucks could get anywhere by a short path from the center. I surrounded it with residential, then commercial, and then industrial zones to create a separation, a gradient of zoning. Only issue was that, well, there was an impressively unsightly dump right in the middle of town, to which everyone had a front row seat. But as long as we surrounded that with parks and enough dirt roads, you'd create enough of a buffer. You see, this city, also too though, was expensive. Maybe not as pricey as the last one, but I tried raising taxes to 15% to fund it, until everyone complained, then slightly lowered them by just barely enough so that people didn't leave, but were trapped and still had to pay them. Then we ran out of money again, so I tried making all of the districts tiny so that we could save half our budget. But that also didn't work. I had failed for the third time. But with no less enthusiasm and a plethora of knowledge from my failures, I embarked on the fourth city, the culmination of all our failed efforts heretofore. Ultimate Pedestrian Tin, the city of the future. In the previous city, dirty industry had ruined everything, since it was too close to the center of town. So this time I decided to create a bunch of different circles for each type of zoning. The central node was the residential circle, a series of concentric rings once again, where we could take advantage of the short radius from the center to provide services like garbage men, education, and corpse removal, which became more and more problematic since I resisted funding it at the beginning, and couldn't figure out why all the cemeteries weren't enough to house the dead at first. Until I funded it, that is. Farther away to the south, but still barely in walking distance, we kept the dirty industry area, where factories coughed up smoke from their warehouses, making sure to keep it far away from our homes and children, but still in walkable distance. And on the east side of town, I began preparing the financial district. Since almost all my city's pedestrian areas were too expensive, I decided it would be a good idea to rely on scammy money-making techniques as alternate forms of playing around with taxpayer money to just barely cover our bills while we expanded toward legitimate financial stability. Unfortunately, the city never actually reached legitimate financial stability. You see, the pedestrian districts are just so expensive to maintain that I had to resort to more and more outlandish methods to make $2 out of one. So instead, we collected taxes, then invested the money, which just wasn't enough to pay our bills, into the death and funeral industry, which turned out to offer highly reliable returns. The rest we invested in cryptocurrency, somehow making enough to generate a profit every fiscal quarter, mainly by buying the dip, and especially since we as the state didn't have to pay capital gains taxes on volatile insider day trading. That helped us finance the creation of more helicopter police stations, which we used to just bulldoze the locations with crime, to get rid of the crime, of course. And since people had to walk, bad people had a more difficult time escaping from our helicopter police state. So as the months went by, our financial district grew, and the people got less and less stupid, as we used the gains from our insider trading to tax them more. To discourage people from being poor, we raised taxes on the poor and small business. That way they'd become rich and have more money to give us in taxes, and then they wouldn't complain about it. Oddly enough, having to walk around never really affected the city since it was designed so well. Most of our financial district, where everyone worked, actually didn't even need in-person employees, so everyone just worked from home instead of walking to work. But ultimately, I'd be lying if I told you that this city was independently sustainable. There were glimmering moments when we were barely breaking even, but most of the bold, exciting city of Pedestrianton is made possible by horrible state-run shadow banking and market manipulation, and this city sustains massive negative cash flows every week. But thanks to the precarious fun of compounding fiscal returns, citizens are relieved of a life of inhaling the deadly fumes of dangerous, environmentally destructive vehicular transport. I think it did a lot of net overall good for society. A population of over 26,000, and it keeps making money despite the fact that it's losing money every week. If you want to congratulate me for doing such a good job, you can do so in the congratulatory section of the video. 100 years. 100 tsunamis. What happens? Today we're going to build a town in city's skylines starting in a pit, hundreds of feet below sea level, then try to build up and survive a series of growing tsunamis over the course of 100 in-game years. Just utterly breaking and ruining the game, making it into a disaster survival simulator. Catastrophic and exciting. But above all, wet. The rules are simple. On January 1st of every year, a tsunami spawns that will strike the center of our town. We must survive the wave and rebuild every year to try and build back up the most waterproofed town possible. And if we manage to survive 100 years without going bankrupt due to disaster relief, the reward? Our city will survive the challenge and will emerge victorious, wealthy and dry. But if we drown beneath the waves, then our city will die out and remain underwater, literally and financially, as we collapse under credit card loans. What would happen? So I spawned in at year 1 to the town of Seattle, $100,000 in the city supply, and I decided to start trying to build upward. Immediately, that plan failed, since we didn't have enough money. I already knew it secretly. This would necessitate building the first city that I would intentionally sacrifice to the first year's tsunami in order to collect tax revenue, and try again later. Unfazed, I carved a precarious road connection down from the highway into the pit, snaking its way down the deadly zoning area. Then I sketched out a few roads and zoned the first areas: residential, commercial, and industrial, carefully spacing out and placing my first few essential services, namely, the dump, right at the entrance to our town. You gotta keep expectations low. So we dumped the poop out of the north, and pumped clean blue, fresh drinking water from the south, powering and watering our town with essential services. The first year passed in relative peace and tranquility. I built up a suburb. Boring, but profitable. And then, at the turning of the new year, the tsunami came, at a pop of 4,000, but with a strength of only 4.0 to start on the tsunami Richter scale. It approached, crested the nearby island, reached the shore, then made an impressive waterfall downhill toward the homes. Mostly just an inconvenience for this first one, flooding some residences. But we got lucky with it striking from the south, where it had broken up on the nearby land masses before reaching our pit. But this was only the first of the next 100. Homes could be bailed out. And so time went on. The second year, the town grew, juicier with taxpayers. There was a fire, ironically, after the tsunami, and we couldn't afford a fire department, not because we didn't have the money, but because I decided it would be a waste to have a fire department in a town with an annual tsunami. And so after the growth, the second year's tsunami came from the west. Larger, more impressive, and scarier than the first. When it struck, this one began to destroy buildings. Not just a few, but almost all of them. Except, of course, a few random factories like Goods Unlimited and Frank's Fish Stick Factory. Also the Ice Cube Factory. I totally threw it. Almost the entire town was destroyed, and it took about 4 months for the water to evaporate into the air. All that so people could move back in and rebuild their homes. Somehow there was still demand. But honestly, the amount of time it took to rebuild all the homes, then collect taxes for half the year, put us just slightly ahead of where we were financially the year before. Naturally, this came to a head with the nail-biting question, which would scale faster, the size of the waves or the size of our wallets? The answer was not obvious. So I did what any confused person should do and just took out a lot of loans. Just a lot of them. Don't look at the horrible interest rates. I couldn't afford a wall, and I didn't know which direction the tsunami would come from. So I decided to start just slightly raising small areas at the bottom of the pit because I didn't have enough money to really protect our city, where rich people would live at the top of the hill and be spared from the deadly waters flooding their neighbors below. Infrastructure. We paved roads atop the hill to link them to the plebs living below in the undercity, and we started burning the garbage in the town to slap a band-aid on the larger problem at hand. There simply wasn't enough time. Then, when there was too much garbage to burn, I just returned to the age-old strategy of destroying everyone's homes if they had too much garbage in them, then collecting taxes from the next people who moved in until they either built up too much garbage too, or their house would presumably be destroyed with the next tsunami. Speaking of which, it was time for the third tsunami. This one wasn't as bad as the last one, and it proved my strategy was working. The rich folks on the higher ground were spared most of the water. The rest barely survived. Then out of nowhere, there was a tornado in 2004, and right when I was about to pay back all of my loans. So we accepted a bailout offer from the federal government, then used the money to expand the small, dry plateau to save more houses from flooding. In 2005, you guessed it, another tsunami hit, but this time it was on the north side of town. Home to our poop dumping site, the Poonami. A wave far more unpleasant and dreadful than any we had yet encountered. I knew immediately that everyone would die. Springing to action, I knew I needed money as well. But I also knew that I needed more money to pay off my loans. So I raised taxes from 9% to 29% 1 month before the Poonami struck our shores. Briefly, we made a killing. Then, when everyone was distracted by their ridiculous tax bills, the shadow of the wave blotted out the sun, purging angry taxpayers in a flood of literal crap. Both neighborhoods, high and low, rich and poor, were devastated, but mainly the poor. It's okay, I did it for the greater good. I began to observe a pattern that, although it would be expensive to raise the outer walls, building a moat inside of the pit itself might protect most of the town from the waves once they had fallen into the pit itself. So I spent the years between 2005 and 2007 raising money by hiking taxes right before the disaster and surprising my taxpayers, then cutting out all civic services during the disaster to save money as I gradually built a moat around the town, which, as it turned out, was almost completely ineffective by the time I had completed it in 2009, since the series of tsunamis and Poonamis was getting ridiculous and out of hand. I had to act soon. The waves were outpacing my tax collection, and the poop water was forming a lake in the center of town that was taking over 6 months to evaporate into the air. Not waterfront property anymore, but poop waterfront property. So in a last-ditch effort to save the town, which wasn't keeping up with the water, I took out $280,000 in loans, and we got lucky with a small, broken-up tsunami in 2010 from the north, giving us just enough money to face the deadly tsunami of 2011, which would normally have destroyed us all, but instead we procrastinated and built up barely enough of a dirt wall on the outside to contain the wave with all the money I had taken out as a loan. That allowed us to collect the uninterrupted stream of tax revenue without everyone's house being destroyed, to then take out 2 smaller loans to actually refinance our most expensive, high-interest loan and save our town from financial suicide. Can you say, massive credit card debt? Amazing to say. Triumphant, we had successfully planned out the first, most difficult years of the tsunami, but greater waves were still yet to come. Knowing that I'd have enough money to keep procrastinating and building massive dirt skyscrapers to contain the Noahic floods, starting in 2012, I took the liberty of expanding the lower town into a densely populated slum. But it was our slum. I repeated the same stupid dirt wall techniques for the tsunamis in 2012 and 2013 when I allowed some of the water to spill over the wall into our moat, making the terrifying properties beneath the cliff to the ocean into luxurious beachfront villas. We were barely alive. I mean it, everyone in town was getting sick and stupid since there was no school. Now we could consolidate. It was time to clean out the stupid people from our town. How would we raise GDP? After all, we needed money to pay for more dirt, to protect ourselves from tsunamis that were growing larger, 2013 to 2020. The waves grew higher and higher on the tsunami Richter scale. By 2021, things started accelerating. I raised density in the lower town, and poured money into procrastinating by building more dirt walls, but only on the side where the tsunami was coming from. The 2021 Punami got through the hole in the highway, so I built a bowl around the overpass to contain the waters. The town was gross and dirty, and I'm not just talking about the poop water. So as we educated our stupid people, we started replacing the factories with offices. This raised GDP from 2020 to 2030, allowing us to erect larger and larger walls, basically just ignoring any approaching tsunamis and continuing with our lives as if everything were okay. Just ignore the giant dirt walls all around you. I stopped noticing the tsunamis at all, except of course whenever they made it through one of the holes, which usually just caused a little bit of flooding. By 2030, education was fully funded, and we started pushing away the poop with clean water. Now we could address long-term systemic health risks. GDP rose, and tax collection was starting to raise enough money that we could actually begin to consider the $100 million idea of raising the entire town, saving us from all the tsunamis once and for all. I decided that this would be high enough that we'd be safe from anything. But it would be expensive, and honestly limited to one cell. There's only so much density you can build in. So starting in 2036, I mostly just left my computer running while collecting taxes, and feeling relatively safe that the town would just run itself with the innocuous visit from the annual tsunami. Time passed and boredom set in. With the funds collected, by 2050, I got back to gaming and paid $10 million to start cleaning the poop into drinkable water, then dumping it back into our moat to slurp up into our water system. With that, we started facing the strongest level 10 tsunami, which stood no chance against our walls. I gotta be honest with you though, from this point I had basically declared victory, but the rest of this playthrough consists of me launching multiple level 10 tsunamis for every year from 2050 to 2100, ultimately at a max of 50 size 10 tsunamis in the end. It didn't make a difference though. Gradually I started just raising all the dirt in town and displacing people from their homes for the greater good, moving them up to higher ground where it was safe. You know, ultimately, I was happy that, although I cheesed my way through the first 50 years, my computer was powerful enough to run day and night, raising capital like a Bitcoin mining farm, just for the sake of showing you what happens when I seek a spiritually fitting end to the dumbest challenge I've ever tried in this game. Just know that I did it for you. It couldn't end any other way than this. And in the end, it was worth it. Can you build a thriving metropolis with only the tiniest possible lot size in the city's skylines? Most of the time when I play Cities Skylines, lot size doesn't matter. The bigger the better. I've used many shapes. Squares, circles, triangles, hexagons, zigzags, squiggly lines, and even the Sierpinski gasket. But since I've fooled around with shape and traffic structures, and never the actual lot size before, I thought I'd try and see if I could build an entire city from only the smallest possible building blocks. I got inspired to try this idea by the YouTuber named Toadies, so be sure to go check her out with the original idea next. But without any further ado, is it possible to make a city with only the smallest possible lot size? So I set out with the first city, One Tileopolis. Perhaps it was naive, but One Tileopolis was an authentic attempt at a miniature metropolis. First, there was one street. Beside it, a row of houses only one tile wide. Then there were a lot more streets and a lot more rows of houses that were only one tile wide. It didn't take long, and before long I realized that I had already made a lot of major mistakes. I could have fit a whole other row of houses back there, but I didn't because I was afraid the houses would join together and accidentally get bigger. And then I would be cheating, so I didn't do it at all. Consequently, the road budget was overwhelming and impossible to fully finance. More roads than homes and surface area, leading to an undesirably labyrinthine asphalt sprawl. It just grew and grew and grew, and then I started running out of money, and then I did run out of money. So I decided to just abandon this first failure of a town. So I began, of course, on the second city. If the first city's roads were excessively expensive, perhaps dirt roads were the solution I sought. Dirt roads, dirt roads, dirt roads. Dirt roads everywhere. Dirt roads here and dirt roads there. This actually worked at first. I had plenty of money because dirt is cheap and affordable. Row upon row of residential, commercial, and industrial zones. Pollution was manageable. I was able to keep it away from the houses by putting other stuff in between and planning healthcare facilities to put a band-aid on the town's pollution problem. When people who lived next to the toxic, poop-spewing factory zones checked into the medical clinics with mysterious and deathly symptoms. Unfortunately, I realized that I had been cheating all along. When some of the commercial zones joined together accidentally into double zones. I felt bad. This was unacceptable and against the spirit of the challenge, so I abandoned the city because I had cheated accidentally. If I hadn't cheated, though, I gotta say, this was a pretty good city, and I learned how to make a profit rather than just running out of money. Again. The third city. I named it Nippolopolis. They say the third time's the charm. This one indeed worked out at last. I once again used dirt to keep everything cheap and affordable. The plan was to checkerboard the city's zones to keep them tiny. And since zones cannot combine through diagonal adjacency, the zones here would indeed remain tiny. I traced in little footpaths to keep everything miniature, and I kept all the pollution away from the rest of the city by segregating the industrial zones from the commercial and residential zones. Since I was now able to put in double rows of developments without cheating by causing two zones to touch accidentally, the city was far more cost-effective and there was more space for developments than roads, and I could focus on other more important civic tasks in developing our town. As it always began in my cities, everyone was stupid again. At least at first, until the elementary schools popped up. And living near the school made them smarter. But then I started to encounter new problems. My people were becoming too smart to just keep working at our primary industry. Fuel storage. Just fuel storage off to the west. That was all we had room for. So I started to build up office buildings right next to the fuel storage industries and between them and the homes to prevent as much toxic poison and death as possible. Offices were erected. But then there was a new problem. There weren't enough even smarter people to work in the offices. So they just built offices, tried to hire people, then gave up and abandoned, then blew up the building, when inevitably none of the dumb people were capable of working there because they were too dumb. So I built them new forums of learning to get smarter, the high school, the university, and even a public library to help them remember everything they'd learned in school and be less stupid. But then I realized that the office lots were also combining, so I was cheating again. But I didn't feel like going back and restarting because everything was going so well and it seemed, well, rather minor. So I started alternating the formations in a checkerboard-like pattern and just carpet bombing the whole town with education, like a nuclear bomb of happiness. Problematically, sometimes commercial squares would level up too much and get overly ambitious in trying to hire staff that were too smart. Then they would self-destruct because no one was, well, we weren't that smart. But gradually our intelligence improved, and the town then did something I didn't expect. It started making a lot of money. Usually my ideas do not succeed in cities' skylines, so I was surprised and I wasn't prepared for this. Now it was time to embark upon novel and risky civil engineering ideas, which I had heretofore never conceived. First, I scaled out the city to immense proportions, generating thousands of dollars a week. The houses grew and leveled up. In city skylines, the houses gain experience from people living in them, and they improve and are able to hold better people after they've been used up by the people who originally lived in them. And so this process occurred across the city, in an astoundingly boring fashion since all the lot sizes were exactly the same. Block after block, everything was exactly the same. But it was perfect. I was creating a utopia of tiny buildings. We educated people even more by surrounding them with elementary schools and forcing them to learn. Then we built a huge university that was just all too enormous. We got so smart that it actually came to the point where too many people were too educated, and they had all of these useless degrees. No one wanted to run the basic factories anymore, and more jobs demanded dumb people to work at them. This created a minor crisis in our economy, and we had to strategically prevent half the neighborhood from going to school by saying they weren't entitled to education since it was too far away. But this was okay since we expanded our territory off the map edge by buying the northern square. The town expanded. Then I replaced all the major dirt roads with pavement again since we could finally afford it. That looked a lot better. Big growth. The houses leveled up and better people got inside of them. You know, it's rare that I get so far into a scenario like this without something going horribly awry, like the whole town getting covered in garbage, or the rampant spread of criminal behavior. So this time I tried to anticipate any potential future snafu that might reach up and ensnare me. People were pretty happy, but why wasn't everyone completely happy? As an answer, I dropped in dog parks, bombing everyone with explosions of happiness through the streets of the city. Happiness achieved. And what about their health? Only 69% for now. So I constructed elder care facilities for the old people who are about to die, and childcare services for the children, and the health of the town improved. What else was there to improve? Traffic, congested, and the noise. I smoothed out 4-lane roads to lubricate the flow of cars. And whenever there was a traffic jam, I just put ridiculous highway entrance ramps that were just goofy. Taking the interstate exit can be fun. I built a prison to keep out the bad people. And I built road maintenance depots to improve the traffic flow and send out utility trucks through the city. I began to see that, through maybe pure chance alone this time, this might be the only time in my entire life that I've created a successful city in Cities Skylines without just messing everything up horribly through some bizarre social wrongdoing. Aside from the fact that the dog parks would sometimes inexplicably and spontaneously combust, everything was pretty much hunky-dory. I had created a tiny utopia of a city without cheating. Well, mostly without cheating. So at this point in time, I decided that the only right thing, the only fair thing to do, gazing upon the level 5 residential zones I had worked so hard to produce, the height of urban development, it would only be fair to launch asteroids on a collision course with the city. No one in the city had suffered like the residents of my former towns, after all. Who were they to deserve such a good life? Rest in pieces, people of Nippolopolis. Nippolopolians, whoever you are, I hope you all burn in hell. At least your deaths were fast, fiery, and exciting. I mean, at least that will always remain as one of my alternate save files. Perhaps I'll load it up another time, but to be totally honest, tiny zones, one tile in the city works. It makes the city look a little uniform, but yeah, it's a totally viable strategy. Anyway, I really wanted to try this out. Thanks again to the amazing YouTuber Toadies for creating this idea. I just wanted to give it a try and I thought it looked like fun. In this video, I'm going to build a city to see if I can survive without water in Cities Skylines. Normally, when you build a city, people need food, water, and shelter. But what if they didn't have any water? No water means no water. But that's not all. There's more. No water also means no poop removal. In Cities Skylines, with no water and with poop everywhere, what roadblocks would stand in my way at creating the perfect utopia? So with that question in mind, I began my adventure. I started a new game with the first city, Dry City. I began by removing the water. I set out on the first day by constructing a road off the highway and a power plant. As mayor, what plans could I lay out to give our town the best possible chance with my designs at the urban sprawl? No water meant the homes would never rise or be upgraded in their levels, and no poop removal meant it would be generally unpleasant, and people would always want to leave. How could I incentivize enough people to stay to create a sustainable city? So I decided to focus on building wide at first. I laid out my plans: residential, commercial, and industrial. I constructed my first set of pipes along with a poop dumping pipe. Sure enough, no poop emerged from the pipe because there was no poop in the town to begin with. And the people didn't even have enough water in the first place to produce any poop at all. But gradually, as people first arrived in the town, they would produce a small amount of poop to start. More on that later, but for now,
As the town grew over the course of the next couple months, people grew thirstier and thirstier, although still yet, no one produced any poop at all. So I decided that we would remain dry. Everyone would be at least somewhat dissatisfied. So the question became, how could I create a financially stable and, well, mostly happy town, albeit a very dry town, lacking altogether in moisture? It goes without saying we were losing money. We were always losing money. Houses started going on fire because of the lack of water. I built a fire department, but they instantaneously ran out of water. I needed more money. I rose taxes to 11, then 12%. For new residents, after great expectations upon moving into the town and building up new residences, people kept getting thirsty, then abandoning their homes. Then we demolished the abandoned homes until the next families moved in and repeated the cycle of disappointment in paying us taxes. Crime was high, but even the police stopped caring because they ran out of water. The elementary school ran out of water too. The children were thirsty and dumb. We were still losing money, but I began to strategize a potential escape from our Sisyphean cycle of build-up, taxation, and abandonment. It worked for now, but this certainly couldn't in the long term. But here's where I discovered a potential loophole. Apparently, when people move into your town in the game, they bring with them some amount of bodily fluids. Conversely, when the houses were all abandoned, we produced no raw sewage. But for a fleeting moment when new families migrated to the town, there was a brief opportunity where their poop, in the form of raw sewage, emerged from the municipal poop pipe. Naturally, I seized the opportunity to trap the raw sewage in a terraformed bowl, like a pool of poop. Then I could pump the dirty water back into the pipes containing the town's drinking water source. While it wasn't an ideal solution because everyone would have to drink the wastewater, it certainly was better than nothing. So I experimented, and sure enough, it worked perfectly, except that it made everyone in the town very sick. A suboptimal solution, but still, this lengthened the period of time people could go before realizing that Dry City was a ticking time bomb in the area of water poisoning. So instead of cleaning the water, which would be too expensive for our budget right now, instead we built a medical clinic to treat everyone's poop water sickness. I lowered the funding enough so that there would be just barely enough demand and money to keep everyone still alive and earn more money for the town. And then with the town producing its entire water supply from literally nothing except the bodily fluids of newly emigrated residents, I began to save up money for a clean pump to treat the poop water and make it cleaner. I installed the new pump, but unfortunately it wasn't clean enough and everyone still kept getting sick. As people remained in the town for a longer period of time, at least we were moving on to more advanced civic problems. Trash was piling up, so we built the dump, piled everyone's trash all on one side of town. Everyone was still sick, so then I built a hospital to keep treating all the sick people. We also destroyed the homes of sick people so that they would move away and healthy people would move into the neighborhood instead. Finally, after about a year of covering up the problem, at last I began to realize that the water simply wasn't clean enough, and I built a more expensive and more advanced water treatment facility to make the poop water completely clean and poop-free. With clean water flowing through the tubes of the water treatment site, demand rose to new heights as newcomers flocked in droves to the newly christened self-watering city. Dry City was sopping with demand. People loved it when there was no poop in their drinking water. They also loved dogs, so we constructed a series of dog parks all around the town to help them ignore the fact that they were drinking their own purified wastewater and concentrate on other things to make up for it. Naturally, they became happier, but happiness wasn't enough. It was sort of like a giant Ponzi scheme. And that's because it was a giant Ponzi scheme. But I needed more water from more people's incoming bodily fluids if I wanted to keep expanding this town. And I had to keep it going if I wanted to maintain the common prosperity. So I decided to terraform another bowl out of the dried out dirt and construct another poop water treatment facility on the shoreline. This would facilitate our backup water supply just in case if things got hairy. But it all kept requiring more and more infrastructure to keep repurposing the wastewater fast enough to meet the water demands of the enlarged, ever-growing town, turgid with demand and thirsty for more. I built more power plants inside of the city near the highway and expanded the industrial, residential, and commercial zones of the city. All this as clean water pumping flickered on and off around the edges of the town. As the urban sprawl began to grow, I started to realize that this would be a near constant balancing act,
the town's primary existential threat forever. Would we be able to clean the poop water fast enough to drink it? Possibly not, but we could still try. In the meantime, I focused on other areas of municipal concern. Were the cops powerful enough to render executive force against criminals? Were we educating the stupid children fast enough to build offices and end our reliance on factories that were killing us all for employment? When I felt like my people were capable of managing themselves on their own, I decided to set out and embark on my true project. The one I'd been saving up for once we were finally financially stable.
Fill back up the entire ocean with our cleaned poop water.
Starting out from the dry, arid wasteland we had been living in. So that's what I did. For the next few years, I began on my side project, spending all the taxpayer money on financing more and more wastewater treatment facilities and pumps to spew out everyone's poop water in the blind hope that it would eventually somehow break even. It didn't, but we created a very impressive river of decontaminated wastewater. Naturally, the town grew, and with it the size and impressiveness of our twin artificial canals. These, of course, led back to themselves as we drank our own cleaned bodily fluids. I then embarked upon a new experiment. If we had amassed such a large population by now, over 17,000 people, surely it wouldn't make a difference if only a few of them didn't get their water. After all, I had bigger dreams than just selling people their own poop water for tax purposes. So I began buying up land beyond our initial square. And then I did the unthinkable. I built another poop water facility beyond our borders and dumped it all into the wilderness. The strategy here was to gradually edge away the moisture from our population until eventually we could restore the river to its former impressiveness. So it was with 1, then 2, then 3 poop water spewing sites. I observed the effects, and as the river flowed, sadly, our bodily fluids merely evaporated upon contact with the air, ultimately rendering my efforts to refill the entire landscape with our bodily fluids inane, without effect, and entirely useless. Nonetheless, it was still admittedly a rather impressive spectacle, even without its own full-flowing man-made river of crap. But how had so many people arrived at this way of life? 10 years. Ultimately, that was all the time it took for our population to rise from a few meager dry troglodytes to a turgid, moist population over 20,000 strong, sopping with demand and thirsty for more. The people were happy, healthy, safe, educated, and mostly they had water, except of course the people who lived on the periphery of the town, but just ignore them because they don't matter as much.
So it was, an entire town, powered by a river of its own crap water. It seems grotesque because it is grotesque.
But at the end of the day, no matter how gross, it's a feat of human engineering we'll need to survive in the coming days of the cataclysm that lies before us.
With all that in mind, there was only one thing left to do.
This was one of the most shameful cities I'd ever created, so I decided to launch a series of increasingly larger meteors at it to feel okay about all the events that had transpired here. And honestly, good riddance. Dry City was dry once again, and things were restored to the way they were supposed to be. Anyway, that's what I think would happen if you tried to design a town without any natural source of water and city's skylines, but you had to use the bodily fluids of all the people who moved there as a drinking water source. I'm Ambiguous Amphibian. A big thanks to my patrons, whose turgid bodies are sopping with support for my videos. Until next time.